Hello, in this tutorial we're going to look at overcoming the double hop issue when trying to authenticate with a SQL Server database but using Windows authentication. We're first of all going to go through and configure the Lightning Data Viewer Web part, and we're going to connect to the Microsoft SQL data source provider. Under the data source tab we're going to provide the SQL Server name that we want to connect to, and we're going to choose the integrated security, which will pass through the token for the browser that I'm currently logged in as across to the SharePoint server or IIS, which will then again try to pass that token across to the SQL database for authentication. Now the alternative is we can set our SQL server to allow mixed mode instead of just Windows authentication, and we can create a SQL login with a username and password, and that username and password can be set here so that every user will be authenticated using the same username and password. However, quite often you want to use integrated security, but what will happen when you try to connect to the underlying database is you will receive an error, and you're actually noticing that you're trying to authenticate as NT authority anonymous logon, which means that once this connection has gone through to the SQL server doesn't actually know who we are. Now this is occurring because the SQL Server database is residing on a SQL server that is separate on a separate machine to the SharePoint server, or where IIS is hosted. So in order for that to work, we need to configure either Secure Store, in which case the Windows authentication will remap our credentials so that it can be passed through to the SQL Server for authentication, or we need to be working in an environment that uses Kerberos authentication for Windows authentication instead of the NTLM protocol. So in this case you'll notice that if I set the Secure Store ID and then we try to bring back the list of databases, that this time it works. We can browse the databases and we have been authenticated. So let's have a look at what's involved in configuring the Secure Store. So as we go into SharePoint Central Administration, we can manage the service applications and under the service applications you'll find the Secure Store service. So we're going to select the Secure Store service, and you'll notice here that we have an application already created. So the first thing that you'll do is generate a key which is going to be used to encrypt the credentials that are stored, but we can also go through and create a new Secure Store application. So we give that application an ID. I had set mine to SQLSS, but you can set this to whatever you want it to be. It could be listed as Northwind, for example, after the database name. We also have the display name, so that can be different to the internal name, and we can also set a contact email address that we want to use as well. The target application type can either be an individual or it can be a group, so you can assign a group of individuals to be authenticated against a single account. I'm going to basically set this one on individual. We're going to click next. We can choose the type of columns that we want to use to collect the credentials and pass through to the underlying database. So if we're using Windows authentication, then we're going to use the Windows username and the Windows password. If we're using mixed mode, then we're going to use the username column and the password data type. You can name the columns however you feel fit. So I'm going to go with a default here, and we're going to click next. We can set the administrators for this target application, and now the target application has been created. The last thing to do is to basically set the credentials that it will use in order to authenticate us. So I'm going to select that, and we'll hit set credentials. So the credential owner I will set through to be myself, and we're basically going to map that through to itself. So we are authenticated as the same user. So once you have set that information, you're good to go. Northwind becomes the application ID, and that value can be set inside the data viewer in the Secure Store ID box. Many thanks.